So, let me get everything set up here. I still have my hair, by the way. I'm still growing it out for charity. Okay. Get everything pulled up that I want to pull up. Okay. Let's go up. Okay. All right. Let me pull up my relevant pages. Okay. Okay. I want to get a few things set up first. Because we are going to talk about a few things tonight. So, excuse me. We might have some people jump on, we might not. It's Friday night and it's late. So hopefully we do, but if we don't, we'll carry on all the same. Greetings and salutations. I realize I've been a little bit inactive lately. Time at work, blah blah blah. That kind of thing. Some of you probably already know this, but in case you didn't, I'm also pretty busy on Sundays now, where I'm actually, in addition to being a Sunday school teacher for the adults at my local congregation, I also happen to be preaching occasionally. So, and I will be preaching, excuse me, this upcoming Lord's Day for the resurrection. Actually, me and my pastor are both going to be preaching. I'm going to be preaching on the cross, and he's going to be preaching on the resurrection. Just for anybody who's interested in that kind of stuff, check out Bible, which is my companion YouTube channel for that kind of discussion. I realize I occasionally use this channel for that kind of discussion, but I try to keep things game related as much as I can. But I've decided to not hide my faith anymore, so to speak. All right. So tonight I'm going to talk about the Hickman Revolution and stories in gaming. Is there a place for it? Is there not? Now, if you want to know my opinions right off the bat, right up front, yes, there's a place for it. I realize that's not a popular opinion in certain OSR circles, and I understand the idea of emergent storytelling. In fact, most of my games are sandboxes in which storytelling emerges from the gameplay. However, there's nothing wrong with having a story centric game as long as you make that kind of, excuse me, in my opinion, as long as you make that up front and stress that up front with your players, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be able to. But I'm going to be quoting off of this article. If you are curious for the article, let me pull up my YouTube channel on my browser real quick. And I will attempt to post the link. Bear with me one moment. I'm probably going to have to mute. Okay. Should be muted. So I am going to post the article link in the comments for anybody who wishes to read it for themselves or follow along. Control paste. And that is the article that I'm going to be quoting. So it's how the Hickman Revolution changed D&D forever, and it's on the Dragonlance Nexus page. The DM layer talks about the Hickman Revolution, which added more story and plot. The criticism, of course, is that it takes away from the gameplay and lethality. You know what? I'll save my opinions towards the end. Now, when I see something like this, I think it's just going to be Hickman bashing. I was pleased to see a very thoughtful examination. Actually, it was Laura Hickman who introduced story into gaming, as quoted by Margaret Weiss. Tracy Hickman responded to that saying, if anything, it's the Laura and Tracy manifesto. Tracy Hickman is quoted as saying, hi, not quite finished with the video yet, but I wanted to pause and say that Laura was the pioneer here. Our first application of story integrated with D&D gameplay was a self-published adventure called Rahazia, a story designed by Laura. The background on the manifesto is more legendary than true, so I'll comment on that shortly. He would further add clarification. Just finished this remarkable video. May I say for the record that I agree with the conclusions 110%. Of course, it provides a link for the video in the article, which honestly I probably should have watched. I just kind of got some things going, and for the sake of discussion. But anyway, while some of the legends surrounding the Hickman Manifesto and its subsequent revolution have a level of truthiness to them, and truthiness is in quotes, it was actually Laura who was the first pioneer of integrating story into games, in our first self-published Rahazia, among others. The conclusions expressed are, in my view, entirely correct. For many years at Gen Con and other conventions, I would give a lecture entitled, It Isn't Whether You Live or Die, It's How You Play the Game. In it, I fervently espouse the idea that character death in the midst of heroic action was vastly preferable to a boring, long-lived character trudging along in the middle of the party and sucking up XP. Indeed, the book I did with my son Curtis, entitled XDM Extreme Dungeon Mastery, focuses on the virtues of heroic demise over boring character levels. Perhaps this could be the subject of an interview with these thoughtful YouTubers, but one needs to consider the fact that this so-called manifesto was a paragraph written for a specific self-published product over 40 years ago. When we tried to translate those principles into Dragonlance not long afterwards. We were pioneering techniques in the integration of story and game on a scale that had never been attempted before. And I'll tell you right now that we were learning as we went. We did the best we could with our guesses on what would work, and it often didn't. Excuse me. Now, 40 plus years later, through my work in books, games, and more recently VR, I've learned a great deal more about players' central role in interactive narrative. Even so, I'm delighted to see that our original principles have stood so well these 4 decades, and that thoughtful videos like this one are still exploring it. Quoted by Tracy Hickman. Um, so, so the whole idea, a lot of the criticism is aimed at it taking away from gameplay and lethality. Um, However, if you look at what they've started with, I think Ravenloft was their first big hit. There's plenty of danger in the story elements. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there's no railroady elements to it, but it works and it's popular for a reason. It gave players a tangible goal um, to work towards, and it also had its fair share of traps and tricks and whatnot. And so let's now, of course, this not did not always work. For example, I think everybody agrees that the Dragonlance modules were pretty bad, especially the second one. I've seen a lot on the first one is not too bad, but it can be quite railroady and a little bit a little kind of railroady at times and blah blah blah, but it's nowhere near as bad as the second one. The second one is ridiculously terrible when it comes to railroad. So I want to, if you'll allow me to kind of, go off on my little rant and raving on this particular subject. I don't think it's any secret that I'm a big video game fan. Always have been ever since childhood. With the exception of music, I've had no hobbies bigger than that because I like the idea of gameplay and mechanics and this, that, and everything else. And of course, I like sandboxy style games, but I also do. I don't shy away from those that are more story centric. And I'm going to turn to a franchise I'm sure you are familiar with, and that is The Legend of Zelda. So, The Legend of Zelda, in my opinion, is the greatest video game franchise of all time. It's my personal favorite. To get a little bit sentimental, my first game that I ever beat by myself was A Link to the Past, which came out in 1991. And I was 2 then, so like I didn't have those skills yet. But whenever I was old enough to play by myself, I did that. And up until that point, I spent many hours as a young boy watching my dad play. And my dad actually taught me how to read off of that game because it had a lot of dialogue. And I didn't want, if I didn't have him, I wanted to know how to read, and he taught me how to read because that was my goal. And I have a soft spot for it. So, but I've played the first one, and I have it on a 3DS over there on my shelf, virtual console, and it's a fun game. It can be cryptic, and to be honest with you, if you aim to 100% it, you will need a guide. um, so let me go to some relevant info because I have The Legend of Zelda brought up. So it's very story light. Most of the story that comes about for The Legend of Zelda in the past several years have been kind of anachronistic in that they've inserted modern games and try to fit it into a storyline to make it cohesive into a timeline. Whereas back in 1986, when this game came out, it was very story light. You're a boy, and you got to go save the princess and defeat Ganon, who's the big bad evil guy, and da 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 da. But one of the reasons why people love this game is that it's non-linear. Even though it's not quite a sandbox, you can tackle any of the dungeons in whatever order you essentially want, with the exception of the final one, which requires, there's a few dungeons that require a few odds and ends to, and treasures to really progress through them and beat them. Um, for example, the final one with Ganon requires you to have the silver arrows, which is something that you're going to have to go to another dungeon to get, if I remember that right. But it was very story light. And the reason people still love it is because it's non-linear. You can essentially tackle any dungeon in whatever order you want. Now, like I said, it can be quite cryptic at times, and especially playing nowadays in modern times, people are going to use a guide that you can find online if you want to 100% complete this game, because, excuse me, it's not like modern games where a bombable wall has some kind of tail on it, sometimes a little too obvious. But it looks like a normal wall, part of the scenery in the original game. So that is where a lot of people go with, in terms of, there's a lot of secrets. What can I find and where can I find it? Let's see here. I'm going to pull up some relevant information to kind of talk about this. So, I mean, I don't have to tell you about the reception of this game, because it spawned a franchise and people loved it. And, it essentially spawned a genre in and of itself. Let's see here. Now, a lot of people kind of incorrectly classify it as an RPG. It's not an RPG. It lacks a lot of role-playing game mechanics, a big one being experience points. You get heart pieces and stuff like that to kind of help bring your health up, and you can find like magical swords and stuff like that to kind of help boost your damage. But by and large, you're not leveling up really. You're kind of just finding these trinkets and kind of upgrading your inventory in a way that makes you on par with other enemies. That way you can actually stand a chance. The blue mail, of course, is one of the most iconic pieces of armor in the Zelda series, in that it is not only cosmetic, but it also helps boost defense. Like, you take half damage, and then there is, I can't remember if it's in the first game or not, but I remember definitely A Link to the Past has this, the red mail, which boosts your defense even further. And it's found in in Ganon's Tower after Turtle Rock. So it's a very late game. But by and large, you just kind of go around exploring, and whatever you stumble upon is what you stumble upon. You grab things and get things, and you become better at it. But I'm going to talk about another entry into the series that is actually my favorite. My favorite is Majora's Mask. Now, Majora's Mask is not a long game. It is a very short game. How many dungeons was in the original I want to say 9. How many dungeons were there in Legend of Zelda? I was right, 9. Okay, cool. So compare that to Majora's Mask, which has 4. Um, Obviously not a very long game. However, while some of the dungeons are uh, short, some of them, um, a lot of them feature really well made designs that, in my opinion, are some of the best in the series. My favorite, of course, uh, being Iconic Tower in at the end of the game, where like you get the light arrows, and then like you go through the dungeon, you clear out one part of the dungeon which is right side up, then you go back outside the dungeon, you shoot a light arrow, and then the world flips upside down, and then you re-enter the dungeon. And so like you're playing through the same areas again but upside down, because there's more treasure and chests and stuff like that. They're suspended in the air, and enemies and secrets and da 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 da. um, so Iconic Tower is actually my favorite in the entire franchise. But most of the time, when you hear people talk about Majora's Mask, they're talking about the story. And it's not so much the story as it is the interactions between the player and the NPCs. Because the NPCs, for those of you that don't know, Majora's Mask is set upon this idea of you have 3 days um, to get the titular Majora's Mask back from the Skull Kid, which is the main antagonist of this game. This is one of the spin-off games that does not feature Ganondorf as a main villain. It doesn't even mention the Triforce, and Zelda has a very brief appearance in a memory which she teaches the player how to play the Song of Time, because it's a sequel to the Ocarina of Time, right? And the reason people love this game is because this operates off a 3-day cycle, a 72-hour cycle, which is not real world time, by the way. It's in-game time. So like 1 hour is like a minute. Um, People end up loving it because these NPCs have set schedules. And they have their own problems. They have their own concerns and this, that, and everything else. And there's a big, obvious moon in the sky with a scary face. Excuse me. And the Skull Kid is going to bring it down, crashing into the earth and killing everybody. You have 3 days to stop this. Now, of course, if you run out of time, the Song of Time reverses time and you go back to day 1. However, all progress that you did, including dungeons, reset. The only exception is if you clear a dungeon, kill the boss, get the remains of the boss, you still have those remains. Those stick in your inventory. So you don't have to repeat that dungeon again if you don't want to. But, it kind of sets this atmosphere in which you have such a limited amount of time and you have to manage it very well. It was, and you can make people's lives better. Some of the most touching scenes that ever occurred in the franchise occur in that game. And it was a very dark game. It was one of the few that actually tackled the concepts like death. As there are actually quite a few NPCs in the game that either are dead or are dying, or they've lost a loved one to death. So it's a very strange little game. Plus the soundtrack is just sublime. It's so good. If you have the time, look up the soundtrack for that game. It's excellent. Especially the when time runs out. The final 6 hours are that soundtrack is just awesome. So, I want to talk about its development because its development was very interesting. So, following the release of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, which is an excellent game, it was a sequel to, well, it was kind of the spin off of A Link to the Past, which I mentioned earlier. And it's available on Switch in a 3D version, and I love it. Yeah, I'm playing through it right now. Um, Following the release of Link's Awakening in 1993, fans waited 5 years for Ocarina of Time, the active development of which took 4 years. By reusing the game engine and graphics from Ocarina of Time, it reused a lot of assets. A smaller team required only 1 year to finish Majora's Mask, with development having started in January 1999. Think about that. They had to come up with a game because they were able to reuse assets. They were allowed to do that. But they had to still come up with a game. So, and it was going to be on the Nintendo 64, like Ocarina of Time was. The game was developed by a team led by Eiji Aonuma, Shigeru Miyamoto, and Yoshiaki Koizumi. I'm terrible at Japanese names, except for Mr. Miyamoto. I know his name very well. And you should too. He's Mr. Nintendo. According to Aonuma, they were faced with very difficult questions of just what kind of game could follow Ocarina of Time and its worldwide sales of 7 million units. And as a solution, came up with the 3-day system to make the game data more compact while still providing deep gameplay. So this is why you had 3 days, from a mechanical standpoint and from a developmental standpoint. According to Aonuma, the concept of time repeatedly looping was inspired by the 1998 film Run Lola Run. Miyamoto and Koizumi came up with the story that served as the basis for the script written by Mitsuhiro Takano. The idea of the 3-day system came from Miyamoto and Koizumi. The development team's main goal was to make a refined, compact successor to Ocarina of Time that would allow players to have different experience each time they played it. And that's true, because certain NPCs, you might be able to fix this part of their life, but if you don't have certain items in your inventory, or you are unable to go to this area yet to get some specific item to help them, you'd have to go back all the time and redo it so that you could see their conclusion to their story. And it would be impossible in several playthroughs to accomplish everybody's story. For example, there's a thief on the first night that appears right around midnight to steal a bomb bag from an old lady who is importing it from out of town. If you stop him, she gives you a mask and she's able to sell this bomb bag at her shop, and you can get that. However, if you do so, you are not able to complete Anju and Cafe's storyline, which requires the thief to return to his hideout after selling the bomb bag at the bazaar shop, which is ran by a crooked guy who runs the trading post. So, if you help her, you can't help Anju or Cafe, because through different degrees of circumstances, you're not, it's going to lock them out on this particular 3-day cycle, and so you must go back in time and fix that. So anyway, Majora's Mask first appeared in media in May 1999 when Famitsu stated that a long-planned Zelda expansion for the 64 DD was under development in Japan. This project was tentatively titled Ura Zelda. Ura translates roughly to hidden or behind. This expansion would take Ocarina of Time and alter the level designs similar to how the Master Quest expanded upon the original Legend of Zelda, which was something that added a replay value to the original Legend of Zelda. It would mix things up totally. So you were encouraged to go out of order sometimes. In June, Nintendo announced that Zelda Gaiden, which roughly translates to Zelda Side Story, would appear as a playable demo at the Nintendo Space World exhibition on August 27th, 1999. The media assumed that Zelda Gaiden was the new working title for Ura Zelda. Screenshots of Zelda Gaiden released in August 1999 shows unmistakable elements of the final version of Majora's Mask, such as the large clock that dominates the center of Clocktown, the timer at the bottom of the screen, and the Goron mask. The story and gameplay details revealed later that month show that the story concept as well as the use of transformation masks were already in place. That same month, Miyamoto confirmed that Ura Zelda and Zelda Gaiden were separate projects. It was unclear if Zelda Gaiden was an offshoot of Ura Zelda or if the two were always separate. Ura Zelda might have become Ocarina of Time Master Quest outside Japan and was released on a bonus disc for the GameCube, given to those who pre-ordered Wind Waker in the US and bundled with the GameCube game in Europe. In November, Nintendo announced a holiday 2000 release date for Zelda Gaiden. By March 2000, what ultimately became final titles were announced: Zelda no Densetsu, Majora no Kamen in Japan, and The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask elsewhere. So, it was it was a very strange, odd game. I remember that very well because I remember being a kid with a Nintendo 64. I played Ocarina of Time, and whenever I played Majora's Mask, it was such a strange animal compared to what came out before. And because Ocarina of Time was like this kind of mixing of, well, no, it was always kind of story driven. Although the gameplay was good. The gameplay was excellent, and a lot of the dungeons were excellent. And it was a pretty long game. You had 3 dungeons for Child Link, and you had 7 plus the Tower of Ganon, so 8, and that's not even including the mini dungeons and stuff like that. It was a very kind of hit the points kind of Zelda game. Big bad evil guy, magical MacGuffins, do this, done, save the world. Majora's Mask was a bit of a different animal. It was not very long when you really consider the dungeon exploration, because there's nothing you're not required to help these NPCs out in their lives. You're not required to care about their problems. You can do the dungeons and wrap it up, and you can do it in one sitting. 4 dungeons plus the final boss. Yeah, totally doable. But you're not really getting the experience because the experience focuses around the story in that game. And so it's one of those things where if you are going to really push a story game in your D&D campaign, my suggestion would be to, number one, make sure no matter what that you bring up you bring in characters, NPCs that the player characters care about. Because if they don't care, they don't want to interact with them. It's as simple as that. The sandbox approach is more about world lore and exploration, stuff like that. Admittedly, a lot of it comes at the cost of NPCs. NPCs might not necessarily be as fleshed out as they could be. But that's because you're pushing a different emphasis. Whereas if you're running something more story, the world lore not quite as important. You want NPCs that the characters care about, that the players care about, and you want you want their problems to really hit home. Like, why should they help them? This, that, and everything else. But at the same time, keep the RPG elements in place. Keep them in place so that those who are playing this game for the first time, like, because you're not trying to please one player, you're trying to please many. And this is why I say be honest about what you plan on running right off the get-go, because if you're planning on running something more story-centric, then everybody at the table at least has the right to know whether or not they want to play this game or not. The old proverb really remains true. You can please some of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all the time. You're not going to hit on everything. And likewise, it's the same with those games. Like I said, a lot of people don't like the original Legend of Zelda because they find it too cryptic and too long, and it relies a lot on mystery and stuff that, admittedly, a lot of the secrets you would probably never know unless you had a walkthrough. And I can say that from personal experience. Yeah, there's a lot of secrets I wouldn't have known about if I didn't have a walkthrough. Um, on the other side of that, you have people that don't care about Majora's Mask specifically because it pushes more story rather than gameplay. Like I said, if you're into dungeon exploration, might not necessarily be the game for you. There's only four of the things. I mean, and don't get me wrong, my favorite one, Icona Tower. It's a cool, in my opinion, is the best designed dungeon in the entire franchise. But that's just one dungeon, and it's admittedly the longest one. So not all of them hit very well. The Great Bay one is pretty bad because of how it relies a lot on water currents and stuff like that, and the puzzles can be too confusing for the sake of being too confusing on that, if that makes sense. But what's up?
I just came to see what you're doing.
I'm streaming. Okay. So there's that. But I reckon that's all I've got for this particular little episode. So hopefully it's valuable to some people who find it. I realize I've been a little inactive lately. Hoping to change that soon. But until then, guys, as always, take care, God bless, and see you on the other side.